The Arizona sun did not merely set. It bled out across the horizon, staining the high desert in violent shades of bruised purple and arterial red. It was the year 1883, and the heat still clung to the earth with the desperation of a dying lover, refusing to let go even as the moon began its ascent. In the small, dusty town of Red Mesa, the silence of the twilight was shattered by a sound that was becoming the new heartbeat of the West. It was a mechanical, grinding screech, a high-pitched wail of steam and iron that echoed off the canyon walls. The train had arrived. The locomotive, a black iron beast belching thick clouds of coal smoke into the pristine air, slowed its momentum as it approached the newly laid tracks that cut through the town like a scar. Dust, fine and red as paprika, billowed up in choking clouds, coating the wooden boardwalks and the Sunday best of the citizens who had gathered to watch. To the people of Red Mesa, this machine was not just transport. It was a promise. It promised civilization. It promised that the lonely, brutal distance between them and the East was finally closing. Inside the small, whitewashed timber structure of the community church, Rosalie Kane stood near the altar. The air inside was stifling, trapped by the closed windows to keep out the train's soot, smelling of beeswax, old hymnals, and the sweat of 50 congregants packed into the pews. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me," she sang, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. It was a beautiful voice, clear and crystalline, possessing a purity that made the rough-handed miners and cattlemen pause in their restlessness. Rosalie was 22 years old, with hair the color of spun wheat and eyes that held the wary intelligence of a creature that knows it is being hunted, though she did not know what was hunting her yet. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her white muslin dress, her knuckles pale. She looked out at the congregation, but she did not see individual souls to be saved. She saw a sea of hats and holsters. The front rows were occupied by the town dignitaries, but the back rows were filled with men who smelled of horse sweat and whiskey, men who wore Colt revolvers strapped low on their hips. Their eyes were fixed on her, cold and appreciative in a way that made her skin prickle. They looked at her not as a woman, but as an artifact, something pristine and untouchable in a land that dirtied everything it touched. Her father, the Reverend Elias Kane, stepped up to the pulpit as the last note of her hymn faded into the rafters. He was a tall man, thinned by fasting and the desert sun, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from gray granite. "My brothers and sisters," Elias began, his voice booming with the practiced cadence of a man who believed he spoke for the Almighty. "Today, we welcome the steel horse. We welcome the road that binds us to the future." Rosalie sat down on the small wooden bench behind the pulpit, smoothing her skirts, trying to make herself invisible. She watched her father's hands grip the edges of the lectern. "Progress," Elias continued, his eyes sweeping the room. "It is God's will that we tame this wilderness, that we bring light to the shadows. For too long, this land has been held in the grip of savagery, walked upon by those who do not know the Lord, who cling to pagan spirits and resist the march of time." Rosalie shifted uncomfortably. She knew the script. It was the same sermon he had preached for 10 years, ever since they had moved to the territory. The savagery he spoke of had a face, and that face was the Navajo people. In the very back of the church, leaning against the rough-hewn support beam near the door, stood a man who did not belong in the congregation. He was tall, with shoulders that filled the space around him, dressed not in a suit, but in a faded calico shirt and buckskin trousers. His hair was black, thick, and pulled back, revealing a face of sharp angles and copper skin. It was Talon Nez. He had come with a delegation of Navajo elders to negotiate with the railroad men, but while the elders waited outside, he had stepped in. He had been told to stand at the back, like a dog allowed out of the rain but not onto the rug, Rosalie thought with a sudden, unbidden flash of anger. Talon did not look at the preacher. He did not look at the railroad map pinned to the wall. He was looking at Rosalie. His expression was unreadable, void of the leering hunger the other men displayed. Yet his gaze felt heavier. It felt like he was seeing the sweat on her neck, the tremble in her hands. He was seeing the woman beneath the hymn. Sitting in the front row, occupying the space of 3 normal men with his sheer presence and ego, was Jonas Pike. The railroad baron wore a suit that likely cost more than the church building itself, the fabric gray and crisp. A heavy gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat like a shackle. He nodded along to the Reverend's words. A benevolent smile plastered on his face. "We will build schools," Pike had told the mayor earlier that day, his voice as smooth as oil. "We will build a clinic. Dr. Evans will finally have a proper place to work." But Rosalie noticed that Pike's eyes did not stay on her father. Every few seconds, his gaze drifted past the altar, through the open vestry door, toward the north, toward the violet peaks of the Chuska Mountains. He looked at the mountains the way a starving wolf looks at a lamb, with absolute, terrifying intent. Beside Pike sat Marshal Burke Caldwell. If Pike was the wallet, Caldwell was the fist. The marshal sat with his legs sprawled, his long duster coat swept back to reveal the star pinned to his chest and the ivory handle of his gun. He was a handsome man in a cruel, sharp way, with a thin mustache and eyes that seemed to lack eyelids, unblinking and watery blue. Caldwell picked at his fingernails, occasionally shooting a glance toward the back of the church, toward Talon Nez, with a sneer of pure, distilled hatred. "We must be the shepherds," Reverend Kane was concluding, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "We must guide the lost, and those who refuse to be guided, well, the path of the righteous cannot be blocked by the stubbornness of the heathens." The service ended with a chorus of amens that sounded more like a business agreement than a prayer. The congregation shuffled out into the dying light, eager to greet the train crew and inspect the goods being unloaded. Rosalie remained behind. Pretending to organize the hymnals, she needed a moment of silence. She needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with the scent of expectation. Voices drifted from the vestry room, her father's voice and the oily baritone of Jonas Pike. "It is a generous offer, Reverend," Pike was saying. $500 for the church expansion, another $200 for the mission school. All we require is your blessing on the new survey line." "The Northern Ridge," her father replied, sounding hesitant. "The Navajo claim that land is special to them." "Superstition," Pike scoffed. The sound of a match being struck against a boot heel rasped through the thin wall. "They claim every rock and lizard is sacred when it suits them. Reverend, think of the souls you could save with a proper schoolhouse. Think of the civilization we are bringing. Do you want your daughter to grow up in a dust bowl, or in a town that rivals Santa Fe?" Rosalie froze, her hand hovering over a leather-bound book. "They say," Elias said slowly, "that the ridge is a burial ground. Ancestral bones? Bones are dust." "Elias," Pike said, his voice hardening. "Progress is living. The marshal assures me that the tribe has no legal claim that will hold up in a territorial court. We just need moral authority. We need the man of God to say that this is the right path." There was a long silence. Rosalie held her breath. "Say no," she thought desperately. "Say it is wrong to disturb the dead." "For the school," Elias said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "If it brings them to Christ, perhaps the sacrifice is necessary." Rosalie felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her father was a good man, she told herself. He believed in peace, but he was weak, and men like Pike feasted on weakness. She turned and fled the church, pushing open the heavy oak doors and stepping out into the evening wind. The sun had vanished, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruise. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs and tore a few strands of hair from her pins. She nearly collided with a solid wall of a man. She gasped, stumbling back. A hand reached out to steady her, a hand with skin like burnished copper, the palm calloused and warm. It was Talon Nez. He had been waiting by the corner of the building, away from the main crowd near the train depot. Up close, he was even more imposing. He smelled of sagebrush, wood smoke, and old leather. He released her arm the moment she regained her balance, stepping back to maintain a respectful distance. Yet he did not lower his eyes. "Miss Kane," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, the English accented but perfectly clear. "Mr. Nez," she stammered. She knew his name. Everyone in town whispered it, usually accompanied by a curse or a warning. He was the scout who had walked away from the army to return to his people, the traitor, the savage. "Your father speaks well," Talon said. His face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of irony in his dark eyes. "He has a strong voice." "Ah, he believes what he says," Rosalie replied defensively, hugging her arms around herself against the chill. "That is what makes him dangerous," Talon said softly. He looked over her shoulder at the church, then back to her. "Tell him that bones are not just dust. Miss Kane, tell him that if they dig up the sleeping ones, the waking ones will not sleep anymore." Rosalie stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He knew, somehow. He knew exactly what had been discussed in that private room. "Why tell me?" she whispered. I just sing the hymns." Talon looked at her then, really looked at her. His gaze swept over her pale face, her trembling hands, the fear in her eyes that warred with curiosity. "Because you are the only one inside who looked like you wanted to run away," he said, before she could answer, before she could ask him what he meant or how he saw so much. The heavy tramp of boots approached. Marshal Caldwell appeared from the shadows, his thumb hooked in his gun belt. "Bothering the lady, Nez?" Caldwell asked, his voice light but laced with venom. Talon's expression did not change, but the air around him seemed to tighten. He shifted his weight imperceptibly. "Just leaving, Marshal." "See that you do," Caldwell spat. "The train brought in fresh whiskey, and my boys are looking for sport. Don't let them find you on the street after dark." Talon gave Rosalie one last, lingering look, a look that felt like a door opening slightly, and then turned. He moved with a silence that was unnerving, disappearing into the deepening gloom of the desert night as if he were made of smoke. Caldwell watched him go, then turned his watery gaze on Rosalie. "You best get home, Miss Kane. The savages are restless tonight." Rosalie nodded, unable to speak, and hurried down the boardwalk. The sounds of celebration from the saloon were already starting to rise, raucous laughter, the clink of glass, the thump of a piano. The civilization her father preached about sounded an awful lot like chaos. She reached the parsonage, a modest house set back from the main street. Inside, the lamps were lit, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Martha Kane, her stepmother, was in the kitchen, aggressively kneading dough as if she were trying to strangle it. Martha was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper opinions, worn down by the frontier life until only the gristle remained. "You're late," Martha said without looking up. "Did you speak to Mr. Curtis?" Rosalie hung her shawl on the hook. "No, Mother, I came straight home." Martha stopped kneading and wiped her floured hands on her apron. She turned to face Rosalie, her eyes critical. "Mr. Curtis was asking about you. He is a good man. Rosalie, a merchant. He has a brick house. He doesn't have to beg for donations to fix the roof like your father." "He is 40 years old," Rosalie said quietly. "And he smells of pickled herring." "He smells of security," Martha snapped. "You are 22. In the East, you would be a spinster. Here, you are, well, you are ripe. You think you can sing in that choir forever. You need a husband. You need a home that isn't made of borrowed lumber." "I don't want a brick house," Rosalie said, the words slipping out before she could check them. "I want—" "You want what?" Martha challenged. "To read your poetry, to stare at the horizon that doesn't put bread on the table. Mr. Curtis is coming for dinner on Thursday. You will wear a blue dress, and you will be pleasant." Rosalie felt the walls of the kitchen closing in on her. The smell of yeast and heat was suffocating. "I'm not hungry," she said. "I'm going to bed." She retreated to her room, a small loft space under the eaves. It was the only place that was truly hers. She didn't light the lamp. Instead, she went to the window and pushed it open. The night air rushed in, cool and vast. The town of Red Mesa was noisy below, but Rosalie looked beyond it. She looked past the train depot, past the saloon, out into the vast, ink-black emptiness of the desert. The moon had risen, painting the sand in shades of silver and gray. In the distance, the silhouettes of the mesas stood like ancient sentinels guarding secrets that white men with railroad contracts could never understand. And then she heard it. It was faint, carried on the wind like a scent, the low, rhythmic thrum of drums, and a voice high and keening, chanting in a language she did not speak but felt in her marrow. It was the Navajo. They were out there, in the darkness, alive and awake. Rosalie leaned against the window frame, her heart beating in time with that distant rhythm. She touched her own throat, where the song usually sat, and felt a strange vibration. Her father wanted to save them. Pike wanted to rob them. Caldwell wanted to kill them. But Talon Nez, he had looked at her and seen that she wanted to run. She thought of the northern ridge, the bones her father had dismissed. She thought of the way Talon had stood between her and the wind, solid and unyielding. A strange sensation washed over her, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the fall would kill you, but wondering, just for a second, what it would feel like to fly. "Thursday," she whispered to the empty room, thinking of Mr. Curtis and his pickled herring. "I won't be ready on Thursday." She stayed at the window for a long time, listening to the drums, listening to the call of something dangerous and free, until the moon was high and the train whistle screamed once more in the night. A mechanical shriek trying to drown out the heartbeat of the land. But the drums did not stop. They were older than the train, and tonight, for the first time, Rosalie Kane felt like she was listening to the right song. 3 nights later, the moon hung low and heavy over the desert, a sliver of bone in a sky of velvet ink. The town of Red Mesa slept the fitful sleep of the guilty. But Rosalie Kane was wide awake. She slipped out of the parsonage with the stealth of a thief, her boots silent on the packed earth. In her hand, she clutched a leather-bound notebook, not the hymnal she carried on Sundays, but a collection of melodies she had transcribed from the wind and her own restless heart. She reached the small stable behind the church, where her mare, Bess, huffed a warm greeting into the chill air. Rosalie did not saddle the horse. She threw a blanket over Bess's back and mounted with a grace that would have scandalized the ladies of the sewing circle. They rode out, away from the sleeping houses, away from the railroad tracks that scarred the earth, toward the jagged embrace of the foothills. She stopped at a ridge known as Coyote's Tooth. It was a place of solitude, where the acoustics of the canyon amplified even a whisper. Here, Rosalie did not sing Rock of Ages. She opened her throat to the night and sang a folk ballad. She had heard a passing drover hum once, a song about a woman who loved the sea. Her voice, unconstrained by the walls of the church, rose clear and wild, mingling with the scent of sagebrush and cooling sand. For a moment, she was free. Then, the gunshot cracked the night open. It was not the random fire of a drunkard celebrating in town. It was sharp, deliberate, and followed instantly by a chorus of shouts. Bess pinned her ears back and danced sideways. Rosalie grabbed the mane, her heart leaping into her throat. The sounds were coming from the dry wash below, a quarter of a mile to the east. Curiosity, dangerous and compelling, seized her. She guided Bess down the slope, tethering the mare to a scrub oak behind a cluster of boulders. Clutching her skirts, she crept forward on foot, peering over the edge of the limestone outcrop. Below, illuminated by the flickering light of 3 campfires, was a scene from a nightmare. A small group of Navajo men had set up a temporary camp. There were no war paints, no weapons drawn. They were sitting around the fire, likely waiting for the morning to continue the negotiations Pike had promised. But they were not alone. Emerging from the darkness like wolves were men wearing long dusters. Around their arms, visible even in the firelight, were bands of red fabric. Pike's private security, and leading them, sitting high on a black gelding, was Marshal Burke Caldwell. Rosalie watched, paralyzed, as Caldwell raised his hand. There was no parley, no reading of rights. "Clear them out!" Caldwell shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the dry air. "They are trespassing on railroad property." "We have a treaty," one of the Navajo men shouted back. Standing up with his hands raised, palms open to show he held no weapon, Caldwell laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The treaty expired when the ink dried. Savage!" The marshal leveled his revolver and fired. The Navajo man crumpled backward, shot through the chest before he could even take a step. Chaos erupted. The men with red armbands spurred their horses forward, trampling the fire, overturning the small shelters. They fired indiscriminately into the panic. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. "Burn it," Caldwell ordered. "Burn it all, make it look like they attacked the survey markers." Rosalie clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her father's words about peaceful expansion rang in her ears, mocking her. This was the expansion. This was the civilization Jonas Pike was buying. In the midst of the swirling dust and smoke, a small figure darted out from a collapsed shelter. It was a Navajo boy, no older than 7 or 8. He was terrified, running blindly toward the rocky slope where Rosalie hid. A rider with a red armband saw him. The man whooped, swinging a heavy torch, steering his horse to cut the child off. The boy stumbled over a loose rock and fell hard, sprawling in the dirt just as the horse reared above him. Rosalie did not think. The training of 20 years, the admonitions to be quiet, to be safe, to be a lady, evaporated. She scrambled over the boulders and slid down the shale embankment, her boots skidding on the loose stone. "Stop!" she screamed. "Stop it!" She hit the bottom of the wash and sprinted toward the child. The rider, startled by the sudden appearance of a white woman in a gray riding dress, hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all Rosalie needed. She threw herself over the boy, shielding his small body with her own, curling into a ball in the dust. The horse's hooves slammed down inches from her head, kicking sand into her face. "What in the hell?" the rider shouted, wrestling his mount under control. Marshal Caldwell rode over, his face twisted in fury. He looked down at Rosalie, his eyes cold and dead. "Miss Kane," he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "What a foolish place for a midnight stroll." Rosalie looked up, coughing, clutching the trembling boy to her chest. "You shot him!" she gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the fallen man by the fire. "He was unarmed. I saw you." Caldwell sighed, the sound of a man inconvenienced by a gnat. "You saw a hostile uprising. Miss Kane, you saw brave men defending the town." He cocked the hammer of his Colt. "And it is a tragedy that you got caught in the crossfire. A martyr for the cause." He raised the gun, aiming directly at her forehead. Rosalie squeezed her eyes shut, hugging the boy tighter. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the canyon wall. There was a whistle of air, and a heavy throwing knife embedded itself in Caldwell's shoulder, right in the meat of the muscle. Caldwell roared, dropping his gun as his arm went numb. Talon Nez was there. He did not yell. He moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a mountain lion. He vaulted over a burning log, scooped Rosalie and the boy up as if they weighed nothing, and shoved them toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a crack in the earth barely wide enough for a man. "Inside," Talon commanded, his voice rough. He spun around to cover their retreat. A volley of gunfire erupted from the red-banded men. Talon jerked violently as a bullet tore across his upper arm, but he did not fall. He returned fire with a Winchester rifle he had pulled from his back, the shots precise and disciplined. He dropped 2 riders before ducking into the crevice after Rosalie. The fissure twisted deep into the rock, turning a corner that blocked the line of sight from the camp. It was dark, smelling of damp stone and ancient dust. Talon pushed Rosalie and the boy all the way to the back, pressing them against the cold limestone. He stood in front of them, his broad back acting as a shield against the entrance. Outside, Caldwell was screaming orders. "Flush them out, I want their scalps!" But the narrow mouth of the cave made it a death trap for anyone trying to enter. Talon fired 2 warning shots near the entrance. Sending stone chips flying, the attackers cursed and retreated. "Leave them!" Caldwell finally yelled, his voice strained with pain. "We have done enough. Let the desert have them. The fire will cover the rest." The sound of hoofbeats faded, leaving only the crackle of the burning camp and the whimpering of the child. In the sudden silence, the sound of breathing filled the small cave. Rosalie was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The boy was clinging to her waist, burying his face in her skirts. Talon turned slowly. In the dim light filtering from the fires outside, Rosalie saw blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt, dark and wet. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His first concern was not his bleeding arm, but her. "No," Rosalie whispered. No." Talon knelt. He spoke to the boy in soft, rhythmic Navajo. The child looked up, tears streaking the dust on his face, and nodded. Talon checked the boy's limbs for breaks, his hands gentle despite the violence he had just dispensed. Then he turned his attention to Rosalie. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he pulled a twig from her hair. His eyes were intense, burning with a mixture of anger and something else she could not name. "You should not be here," he said. "This is not a place for choir songs." "They murdered him," Rosalie said, her voice rising in hysteria. "Caldwell. He just shot him. He wasn't doing anything." "I know," Talon said flatly. He sat back against the rock wall and ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt hem. He began to bind his own wound, gritting his teeth. "This is how the railroad is built. Rosalie, iron and blood. Mostly our blood." Rosalie watched him struggle with the knot. Without thinking, she reached out. "Let me—" Talon froze as her fingers touched his skin. His arm was hot, the muscles hard as iron under her touch. She tied the bandage tight, her hands trembling only slightly. "Why did you save me?" she asked softly. "I am one of them." Talon looked at her. The distance between them in the cramped space was less than 6 inches. She could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "You ran into the fire for a child not of your blood," Talon said. "That makes you not one of them." They stayed there for 2 hours, until the fires outside burned down to embers. Talon scouted the exit, then returned. "You must go back," he said, "before dawn breaks. If they find you here with me, it will be worse for you than a bullet." He walked her back to where Bess was tethered. The horse was spooked, but waiting. Talon lifted Rosalie into the saddle with ease. He handed the boy up to sit in front of her. "Take him to the ridge," Talon instructed. "My grandmother will be waiting near the 3 twisted pines. Drop him there. Do not let anyone see you enter town." "Talon," she said, saying his name for the first time. It tasted like smoke and earth. "I will tell them. I will tell my father. I will tell the sheriff." Talon looked at her, and his expression was filled with a pity that cut her deeper than the cold. "The truth is a heavy stone. Rosalie, be careful where you drop it." He slapped the horse's flank, and Bess took off into the night. The ride back was a blur of shadows. Rosalie dropped the boy where Talon had said a silent, wrinkled woman emerged from the brush to take him, offering no word of thanks, only a nod. Rosalie reached the parsonage just as the eastern sky began to gray. She stabilized Bess, wiped the dust from her face, and crept back into her bed. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise on a world she no longer recognized. She thought she could get ahead of the lie. She thought she had time. She was wrong. By 8 o'clock, the town was buzzing. The story had spread with the speed of a prairie fire, fueled by free drinks Caldwell had bought at the saloon to soothe his wounded shoulder. According to Caldwell, a war party had attacked the survey camp. They had burned their own supplies in a frenzy. And, most damning of all, they had been seen dragging a white woman into the rocks. When Rosalie walked out of her front door at 9 o'clock, intending to march to the sheriff's office, the street fell silent. Mrs. Higgins, the baker's wife, pulled her children behind her skirts. 2 miners stopped their conversation and spat on the ground as she passed. Rosalie faltered. She walked toward the church, seeking sanctuary, seeking her father. A crowd had gathered at the church steps. They parted as she approached, creating a gauntlet of accusing eyes. And then she saw it. On the double oak doors of the community church, the doors her father polished every Saturday, someone had taken a charred log from a fire and scrawled crude, jagged letters across the white wood. Navajo's whore. The words were black, ugly, and screaming. Rosalie stopped. The breath left her lungs. She felt as though she had been punched in the stomach. She looked around, searching for a friendly face. She saw Mr. Curtis, the man who wanted to marry her. He turned his back, adjusting his hat, refusing to look at her. The church doors opened. Reverend Ellis Kane stepped out. He looked at the crowd, then at the defaced door, and finally at his daughter. His face was gray, aged 10 years in a single night. "Father," Rosalie said, stepping forward. "Father, it is a lie. Caldwell is lying. I saw him kill a man. I saw him burn the camp." Elias looked down at her. His eyes were wet, but there was fear in them, fear of the mob, fear of Pike, fear of losing the fragile position he held in this hard town. "The marshal says you were with the Indian," Elias said, his voice trembling. "He says you were intimately involved, that you ran to him." "I ran to save a child," Rosalie cried. "Talon saved my life." A murmur went through the crowd at the mention of the name. Talon. To speak it so familiarly was a damnation in itself. Jonas Pike stepped out from the shadow of the vestry. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture that looked like support, but was heavy with ownership. "She is confused, Reverend," Pike said smoothly. "Shock does strange things to a woman's mind. The savages possess certain herbs, influences." "I am not confused," Rosalie shouted. She turned to the crowd. "There was no attack. It was murder. I saw the red armbands." "Enough," Elias roared. The sound cracked through the morning air. Rosalie froze. Her father had never raised his voice to her in anger. "Go inside," Elias whispered harshly. "Go inside and pray for forgiveness. Rosalie, do not speak another word of this madness." "But father—" "Inside." Rosalie looked at him. She looked at Pike, who was smiling, that faint, oily smile. She looked at the hateful words scrawled on the door of God's house. She realized then that the church was not a sanctuary. It was just another building owned by the railroad. She walked past her father, head high, though her legs felt like water. She entered the dim, cool nave of the church. She walked all the way to the altar and stood before the simple wooden cross. The truth is a heavy stone. Talon had said she could stay here. She could weep, repent for sins she had not committed, marry Mr. Curtis, and let the town scrub the charcoal from the door. She could be safe. But outside, in the desert, a man lay dead for wanting to keep his land. A boy was alive because she had moved, and a warrior was bleeding because he had stood in front of her. Rosalie touched the cross. The wood was cold. If she stayed silent, the girl who sang the hymns was dead anyway. The only thing left to decide was who Rosalie Kane would be when she walked back out those doors. She turned around. The empty pews stared back at her. She was alone, but for the first time in her life. The silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like a decision. The parsonage felt less like a home and more like a tomb. For 2 days, Rosalie Kane had moved through the rooms like a ghost, ignoring the silent recriminations of her stepmother and the averted gaze of her father. The town of Red Mesa had not scrubbed the charcoal words from the church doors. Instead, they had let the sun bake the insult into the wood. A black scar warning anyone who dared to cross the invisible line between civilization and the wild. She had nothing left. Her reputation was ash. Her father's love had proven brittle when tested against the weight of public opinion. On the third night, Rosalie made her choice. She packed a small saddlebag with dried beef, a canteen of water, and the heavy wool blanket from her bed. Last, she tucked her leather-bound notebook of melodies inside her bodice, against her heart. It was the only scripture she believed in anymore. She saddled Bess in the dark, her hands steady. She did not leave a note. Her absence would be enough of a message. The desert at night was a deceptive lover, cool and inviting. But as the sun breached the horizon, it turned into a furnace. Rosalie was not a tracker, but she knew where the sun set. and she remembered the silhouette of the ridge where she had left the Navajo boy. She pushed Bess toward the Chuska Mountains, following the faint, wind-blown ruts of wagon wheels and unshod pony tracks that she prayed belonged to Talon's people. By noon, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. The landscape was a monotonous, beautiful hell of red rock and sagebrush. The water in her canteen grew hot, tasting of tin. By late afternoon, Rosalie was no longer riding. She was merely clinging to the saddle horn. Bess stumbled, her coat slick with foam. Rosalie slid from the horse's back, her legs buckling. She fell into the red dust, the grit coating her tongue. She lay there, staring at the relentless blue sky, wondering if this was how she would die, not as a martyr, but as a fool who thought she could cross a world she did not understand. A shadow fell over her. She squinted, expecting a vulture. Instead, she saw a face weathered like old leather, framed by silver hair tied back with wool. It was the old woman from the ridge, the grandmother who had taken the boy. The woman did not speak. She offered a gourd of water, cool and sweet. Rosalie drank greedily, coughing as the liquid hit her parched throat. The woman made a clicking sound to Bess, calming the horse, then gestured for Rosalie to stand. There was no pity in her eyes, only a pragmatic recognition of survival. She helped Rosalie mount, then took the reins, leading the horse through a labyrinth of slot canyons that Rosalie would have never found on her own. They arrived at the camp at dusk. It was hidden in a deep, verdant box canyon, sheltered by towering sandstone walls that glowed amber in the fading light. Hogan's traditional dwellings made of logs and packed earth dotted the valley floor. Smoke curled from central fires, smelling of cedar and juniper. The arrival of a white woman was like a stone dropped in a still pool. Activity ceased. Children stopped playing and ran to their mothers. Men reached for rifles that leaned against the Hogan walls. The silence was heavy, thick with a hostility that made the air hard to breathe. Rosalie sat atop Bess, her spine rigid. She felt the weight of 100 eyes. They did not see a girl. They saw the railroad, the soldiers, the broken treaties. Talon Nez emerged from the largest Hogan. He wore no shirt, his chest wrapped in white bandages that stood out starkly against his copper skin. He stopped dead when he saw her. His expression was not welcoming. It was a mask of thunderous disbelief. He strode forward, grabbing Bess's bridle. "You have a death wish, Rosalie Kane," he said low in his throat. "Why did you come here?" "I had nowhere else to go," she rasped, her voice cracked from the heat. "This is not a sanctuary for stray kittens." Talon snapped. An older man, his face a map of deep wrinkles, stepped forward. He spoke sharply in Navajo, gesturing at Rosalie with a disdainful flick of his hand. Other men murmured in agreement. The word Bilagana white person was spat out like a curse. "He says we should tie you to your horse and send you back," Talon translated, his voice flat. "Or trade you to Caldwell for the release of our horses he stole last month. They think you are a spy." Rosalie slid down from the saddle. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to stand tall. She looked at the elder, then at the circle of angry faces. She took a breath, summoning the memory of the songs she had listened to in the dark, the phonetics she had scribbled in her notebook. Do she, spy, duh," she stammered. "I am not a spy." The camp went silent. The pronunciation was clumsy, the accent thick, but the words were intelligible. She turned to the elderly. "Caldwell, he shot first, not Navajo. Caldwell." She pointed to her own chest. "I saw. I speak the truth." It was broken, fragmented, like a child learning to speak, but the effort hung in the air, vibrating with sincerity. She did not look down. She met the elder's gaze, her blue eyes watering from the dust but unblinking. Talon watched her, his jaw tight. He looked at the woman who had been terrified in the church, the woman who had trembled in the cave. Now, she stood in the heart of enemy territory, armed only with 3 words of a language that was forbidden in the territory's schools. He stepped between her and the elder. "She speaks true," Talon said, his voice carrying to the back of the circle. He switched to English so she could understand. but his tone was meant for his people. She ran into the fire to save the boy. "Little Hawk, she took the bullet meant for him." He tapped the bandage on his own chest. "This wound is mine, but she earned her own scars that night. She is under my protection." The elder looked at Talon, then at Rosalie. He studied her hands, which were blistered from the rains, and her dress, which was torn and stained with the red earth of their land. "She stays," the elder said in English, the words heavy and slow. "But if she brings the soldiers, her blood will water the corn." The crowd dispersed slowly, the tension receding but not disappearing. Talon turned to Rosalie. "You are a fool," he said, but the hardness was gone from his eyes. "Come, you need food." For the next week, Rosalie lived in a world that stripped her of every pretension she had ever held. The civilization of Red Mesa, with its corsets, its silverware, and its rigid social hierarchies, seemed absurd here. She slept in a small brush shelter near Talon's hogan. She learned that water was precious, not to be wasted on washing dust from skirts. She learned that silence was a form of conversation. She tried to help. Her first attempt to make fry bread resulted in a charred, inedible puck that made the children giggle behind their hands. But she did not give up. She learned to gather piñón nuts, to card wool, to start a fire with flint and steel until her knuckles bled. One evening, sat by the fire, Talon pointed up at the sky. "You call that Orion," he said, tracing a shape in the stars. "We call him the first slender one. He protects the people from the cold months." "In the church," Rosalie said softly, "they say the stars are just lamps God lit for us." "That is the problem with your people," Talon said, poking the fire with a stick. "You think everything was put here for you. The stars, the land, the water. You think you own the world just because you can draw lines on a map." He reached into a leather pouch at his waist and pulled out a piece of paper. It was wrinkled and stained, covered in dense legal script. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Rosalie shook her head. "It is the contract Pike made the elders sign 3 years ago," Talon said. "He told them it was a treaty for safe passage, a promise that the train would only pass through the valley floor." He smoothed the paper out on his knee. "But I learned to read your laws in the army. Look here." He pointed to a paragraph buried in the dense text. "Rights to all mineral and subterranean resources within 5 miles of the track, including the relocation of any obstructions deemed necessary for the stability of the line." "Obstructions," Talon spat the word. "The northern ridge. He knows there is silver in that rock. But that ridge is where we bury our dead. It is where the spirits rest before they move on. To dig it up is to curse us all." Rosalie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "My father, he thinks it is just empty land. He thinks he is trading dirt for a school." "Your father is a man who looks at the sun and sees a gold coin," Talon said. "Pike knows exactly what he is doing. He will provoke a fight, claim we broke the peace, and then use the army to clear us out. Legally. That was why Caldwell shot the man," Rosalie realized, the horror settling in her stomach like a stone. "To start a war, to make you the aggressors." "Yes," Talon said. "And now they have you. The white woman was stolen by savages. You are the perfect excuse for a massacre." "Rosalie." While the campfire crackled in the canyon, miles away in the smoky office of the Red Mesa Marshal, the narrative was being written exactly as Talon feared. Marshal Burke Caldwell sat with his boots up on the desk, nursing a glass of whiskey with his good arm. His shoulder throbbed where the knife had gone in, a constant reminder of the humiliation. Jonas Pike stood by the window, looking out at the dark town. "The telegraph to Washington has been sent," Pike said. "We reported a hostile insurrection, 200 armed braves, a hostage situation." "When does the cavalry arrive?" Caldwell asked. 10 days, Pike said. "Fort Wingate is sending a detachment. Until then, we need to keep the anger hot. The miners are restless. They want blood." Caldwell smiled, a thin stretching of his lips. "I can give them blood. We will ride out tomorrow, burn a few cornfields, shoot some sheep, make them hungry. If they strike back, we have our justification to wipe the canyon clean before the soldiers even get here. And the girl," Pike asked, turning. What if she is alive? Caldwell took a sip of whiskey. If she is alive, she has turned. No decent white woman survives a week with a buck like Nez without being corrupted. If we find her, she is a tragedy. If she dies in the crossfire, she is a martyr. Back in the canyon, the wind had picked up, whistling through the sandstone flutes. Talon sat outside his hogan, cleaning his rifle. He began to sing. It was a low, mournful sound, a chant that seemed to vibrate with the earth itself. It was a song for the man Caldwell had murdered, a song to guide a confused spirit home. Rosalie sat nearby, wrapped in her blanket. She listened, closing her eyes. The melody was complex, sliding between quarter tones that Western music usually ignored. But her ear, trained on the strict harmonies of hymns, began to find the pattern. It was a pattern of grief, but also of endurance. Tentatively, she opened her mouth. She did not sing words, for she did not know them. She hummed a counter-melody, a high, clear soprano line that wove around Talon's baritone like a silver thread through dark fabric. Talon did not stop. He did not look at her, but his voice swelled, making space for hers. The two voices rose together into the night. One was the sound of the earth, deep and resonant. The other was the sound of the wind, sharp and longing. They clashed and resolved, creating a harmony that was neither Navajo nor white. It was something new. It was fragile, terrifying, and achingly beautiful. As the last note faded, leaving a silence that felt charged with electricity, Rosalie opened her eyes. Talon was looking at her. The rifle lay forgotten across his lap. "You have a ghost in your throat," he said softly. "I am not a ghost," Rosalie said. Her voice was steady now. The fear that had defined her life, fear of her father, fear of the town, fear of her own desires, was gone. In its place was a cold, hard anger. She stood up. The blanket fell from her shoulders. "I am not a victim, Talon, and I am not a hostage." "No," Talon agreed, standing to face her. "You are not. Pike needs a war," Rosalie said, her mind working fast. "He needs me to be the helpless victim to justify it. If I stay here hiding, I give him exactly what he wants. If you go back, they will destroy you," Talon warned. "They will say you are mad. Or worse." "Let them say it," Rosalie said. She looked at the contract lying on the ground. "I am the daughter of the Reverend. I am the voice of the choir. They trust my voice." She walked over and picked up the contract. "I am going to learn this," she said, tapping the paper. "Every lie, every stolen acre. And then I am going to make them hear it." Talon looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was not a polite smile, nor a happy one. It was the smile of a warrior who realizes he is no longer fighting alone. "Then we must prepare," Talon said. "Because when you speak, Rosalie Kane, you must shake the mountains." Rosalie looked out at the dark canyon walls. She felt the spirit of the place, the ancient bones in the ridge, the breathing of the sleeping camp. She was no longer the girl who sang Rock of Ages to a room full of guns. She was something else. She was the storm that was coming for Red Mesa. The council of elders met not around a roaring fire, but in the dim, suffocating heat of the medicine hogan. The air smelled of dried cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, a restless spirit battering against the mud walls. But inside, the silence was heavier than the stone. Talon Nez sat cross-legged on a sheepskin rug, his wounded arm bound in fresh linen. Beside him sat Rosalie Kane. She wore a dress made of buckskin, borrowed from the woman who had found her. But she still carried herself with the rigid posture of the church choir. "The soldiers are coming," the elder, Hastin TSO, said. His voice was like grinding stones. "Runners say they are gathering at Fort Wingate. 10 days, maybe less." "We cannot fight the cavalry," Talon said, his voice low. "We have 30 rifles. They have Gatling guns. If we fight, we justify their war. If we run, we lose the land. Then we die." A younger warrior spat from the shadows. "Better to die with blood on our hands than starving in a reservation camp." "No," Rosalie spoke up. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the masculine tension of the room. "You do not have to die, and you do not have to run." All eyes turned to her. A week ago, she would have withered under such scrutiny. Now, she met their gazes. "Pike does not want a war," Rosalie continued. "Wars are expensive. Pike wants the land for free. He relies on that contract. He relies on the map that claims the northern ridge is empty wasteland, not a burial ground." "Sss, the paper is locked away," Talon reminded her. "In the railroad office. A vault of steel." "I know the office," Rosalie said. "I know the vault. It is a Mosler safe. My father used to take me there when he blessed the foundation. Pike keeps the combination in a ledger he thinks no one reads, but he forgets that servants and daughters are invisible to men like him. You cannot just walk in." Hastian TSO said, "You are the woman who ran away to the savages. They will shoot you on sight." "They will not shoot the prodigal daughter," Rosalie said, a cold determination hardening her features. "Not if she comes crawling back, begging for forgiveness. Not if she tells them she was kidnapped, confused, and has seen the error of her ways." Talon stiffened beside her. "You mean to lie, to say we took you by force?" "I mean to give them the story they want to hear." Rosalie turned to him, her eyes fierce. "I will play the broken girl. I will let my father weep over me. I will let Pike gloat. And while they are celebrating their victory, I will take the map and the original contract. Without that paper, Pike has no legal standing to call the army. Without that paper, he is just a thief." The silence returned, but this time it was thoughtful. It was a desperate plan, a plan that relied entirely on the courage of a woman they had once considered an enemy. "It is dangerous," Talon said, his jaw tight. "If Caldwell suspects you, Caldwell thinks I am weak," Rosalie said. "He thinks all women are weak. That is his blind spot." The council deliberated until the moon was high. Finally, Hastian TSO nodded. "Go, but know this. Rosalie Kane, if you fail, the sun will not set on our people again." The preparations for her departure were made in haste. She would leave at first light. But the night stretched out before them, vast and full of unspoken things. Talon led her up the narrow trail to his own hogan, perched high on a ridge overlooking the sleeping camp. It was a solitary place, away from the others. A place where a man who walked between two worlds could find silence. Inside, it was small and intimate. The ceiling was low, forcing them to stoop slightly. A small fire burned in the center, casting dancing shadows against the log walls. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. Against the far wall was a bed, not a pile of furs on the ground, but a sturdy frame built of rough-hewn pine, covered in buffalo robes and wool blankets. It was a warrior's bed. It looked hard, unforgiving, and solitary. Rosalie stood by the fire, shivering despite the warmth. The reality of what she had promised to do was settling in. Tomorrow, she would have to walk back into the lion's den. She would have to look into the eyes of the man who had tried to kill her and pretend to submit. Talon moved to a wooden chest in the corner. He returned, holding a knife. It was not a kitchen tool. It was a blade of obsidian, black as night, with a handle wrapped in leather. "Take this," he said, holding it out to her. Rosalie took it. The stone was cold, the edge terrifyingly sharp. "Where do I hide it?" she asked. "In your boot, or against your thigh," Talon said. He stepped closer, his large frame blocking out the firelight. "Rosalie, tomorrow you go into a place where I cannot follow. My arrows cannot reach the marshal's office. You will be alone." "I have been alone for a long time." "Talon," she whispered, "even in the church." "If they trap you," Talon said, his voice rough with an emotion he was trying to suppress. "If Pike tries to keep you, use the knife. Not on yourself, on them." He reached out and tilted her chin up. "If you must choose between fear and freedom, choose freedom. Always." Rosalie looked up at him. The firelight flickered in his dark eyes, illuminating the raw concern there. She felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. Not fear, but a desperate need to be anchored before she was cast adrift. She raised her hand and touched her own neck. There, just below her ear, was a faint, angry red line. A friction burn she had received the night of the ambush, when one of Caldwell's men had grabbed her by the collar, twisting the fabric until it choked her like a garrote before Talon had intervened. It was the mark of her near death, the mark of the noose that awaited her if she failed. "Talon," she said, her voice shaking not with terror, but with a sudden, fierce bravery. "Hoot me." Talon froze. "What? Hoot me," she repeated, her fingers tracing the scar. "Here." She titled her head back, exposing the vulnerable column of her throat, the red mark standing out against her pale skin. "They tried to choke the life out of me," she whispered. "They tried to make me nothing. Put your mouth where their violence was. Make it yours." Talon understood. She was not asking for a kiss of seduction. She was asking for an exorcism. She was asking him to overwrite the memory of pain with the memory of him. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she did not, he lowered his head. His lips brushed the angry red line on her neck. Rosalie gasped. His mouth was hot, shocking against the cool skin. He did not kiss her gently. He kissed her with a desperate, claiming intensity. He pressed his lips against the scar as if he could suck the poison of the memory out of her blood. Her knees gave way. She sank backward, and Talon caught her, guiding her down onto the narrow pine bed. The bed knew no mercy. It was hard, smelling of pine resin and the musk of the man who slept there. It did not cushion her. It grounded her. It forced her to feel every point of contact her back against the wool. Her legs tangled in her skirts, and the heavy, solid weight of Talon pressing her down into the mattress. "Rosalie!" He groaned against her skin, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling the pins loose until the golden mass spilled over the buffalo robe. "Don't stop," she breathed. Her hands found his shoulders, gripping the hard muscle. She had been raised to believe that the body was a vessel of sin, something to be hidden and denied. But as Talon's hands moved over her rough, calloused, yet reverent, she felt no sin. She felt only a terrifying, blinding light. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the slope of her shoulder, the pulse that hammered frantically at her wrist. Every touch was a reclamation. Mine, his hands seemed to say, not the churches, not the towns, not the marshals, mine. She arched against him, a sound escaping her throat that was half sob, half prayer. The sensory overload was absolute. The scratch of the wool, the heat of the fire, the taste of salt on his skin. She tried to turn her head, to hide her face in the pillow, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the sensation. "Look at me," Talon commanded, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Do not run away from yourself." She forced her eyes open. He was hovering above her, his face stark with desire, his long hair falling around them like a curtain, shutting out the rest of the world. "I am here," she whispered. He kissed her mouth then, and the world dissolved. It was a kiss of earth and iron, of two people who had found each other in the wreckage of a collision. Her hands slid under his shirt, touching the bare skin of his back, feeling the scars that mapped his own history of violence. They lay tangled on the narrow bed, the air in the hogan growing thick and hot. Talon's hand moved down her side, resting on the curve of her hip, his thumb tracing the line of her waist through the buckskin. He pulled her flush against him, and for the first time, Rosalie felt the undeniable evidence of his desire. It frightened her, and yet it thrilled her. It was real. It was honest. She shifted, pressing closer, silently asking for more. Talon froze. His breathing was ragged, harsh in the quiet room. His forehead rested against hers, their sweat mingling. He stayed there for a long moment, a statue carved of tension and restraint. Then, slowly, agonizingly, he pulled back. "Talon," she whispered, the word a plea. He rolled onto his side, pulling her with him so that she was cradled against his chest, but he moved his hands to safe territory. Her hair, her face. "No," he said, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "Not tonight." "Do you not want me?" Rosalie asked, the old insecurity rising. "I want you more than I want my next breath." Talon said fiercely. He took her hand and pressed it to his heart, which was beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Can you feel that that is yours? He looked into her eyes, his expression solemn. Tomorrow, you walk into a pit of vipers. You must walk in there with your head high. You must be sharper than steel. He stroked her cheek with his thumb. If we do this tonight, if I take you now, the town will look at you and they will see it. They will use it to shame you. They will say you are exactly what they wrote on the church door. I don't care what they say, Rosalie protested. I care, Talon said. I will not let them use your body as a weapon against you. When we lie together, Rosalie Kane, it will be when you are free. It will be when you can stand in the sun and tell them to go to hell. Not before. Rosalie stared at him. She realized then that this refusal was the greatest act of love he could have offered. He was protecting her honor, not for the sake of society, but for the sake of her own strength. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of him. Hold me, she whispered. Just hold me until the sun comes. I will not let go, Talon promised. They lay together on the merciless bed, fully clothed but stripped bare in spirit. The fire died down to embers, casting a deep red glow over the room. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside, amidst the firs and the silence, Rosalie Kane finally fell asleep, anchored by the arms of the warrior who loved her enough to wait. The morning arrived with a brutal, blinding clarity. The sky was a hard turquoise, vast and indifferent. Rosalie stood outside the hogan, Bess saddled and waiting. She wore her old gray riding dress, which she had mended and cleaned as best she could. The obsidian knife was tucked securely into her boot. She touched her neck. The friction burn was still there, but now it tingled with the memory of Talon's mouth. It was no longer a badge of victimhood. It was a secret seal of protection. Talon stood by the horse's head. He does not touch her now. The time for softness had passed. He was the scout again, alert and dangerous. Ride to the northern pass, he instructed. Wait until noon, then ride down the main road into town. Make sure they see you coming from the desert, looking exhausted. I will get the papers, Rosalie said. I will be back before the moon is full. If you are not back, Talon said, I am coming for you. And I will not bring a treaty. Rosalie mounted the horse. She looked down at him, memorizing the sharp angles of his face. Talon Nez, she said softly. Keep my bed warm. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. It is your bed now. Rosalie? She turned the horse and rode out, her back straight, leaving the sanctuary of the canyon for the open, hostile desert. She was terrified. Yes, but underneath the fear was a core of steel that had been forged in the fire of the previous night. She was not running away anymore. She was attacking. 5 hours later, in the town of Red Mesa, a telegraph boy ran from the depot to the marshal's office. Inside, Marshal Burke Caldwell sat with his feet on the desk, watching Jonas Pike clean his spectacles. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and triumph. The troops are mobilized, Pike said, holding his glasses up to the light. Major Donovan says they can be here in 4 days if they push the horses. We just need to hold the line. We can hold, Caldwell grunted. The savages are scared. They haven't shown their faces in a week. The door burst open. The telegraph boy stood there, panting. Marshal Mister, Pike, you need to come see. What is it, boy? Caldwell snapped. It's her, the boy gasped. It's the preacher's daughter. She's riding in. Caldwell exchanged a look with Pike. A slow, predatory grin spread across the marshal's face. Is she alive? Pike asked. Barely, the boy said. She looks broken, sir. She's heading straight for the church. Pike put his glasses back on. Well, the stray lamb returns. This is better than a corpse, Caldwell said, standing up and checking his revolver. We will convene a hearing immediately, a moral inquiry. We will put her on the steps of the church and make her tell the town exactly what those animals did to her. It will whip the town into a frenzy, Pike agreed, his eyes gleaming with calculation. By tonight, Every man in Red Mesa will be ready to ride into that canyon and slaughter every living thing to avenge her honor." They walked out of the office, stepping into the blinding afternoon sun, confident in their web of lies. They did not know that the woman riding slowly down Main Street was not a lamb coming to the slaughter. She was the butcher, and she had brought her own knife. The heavy oak doors of the community church of Red Mesa still bore the faint, scrubbed-out shadow of the charcoal words, "Navajo's whore." The town had tried to wash it away with lye and sand, but the wood had drunk the insult deep into its grain, leaving a bruised, gray stain that whispered the accusation to everyone who entered. Inside, the air was thick enough to choke on. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, but the heat of the Arizona day was already pressing against the stained glass, turning the sanctuary into a kiln. Every pew was filled. Miners with coal dust still in their fingernails sat shoulder to shoulder with the wives of merchants who fanned themselves vigorously with hymnals. They had come not for salvation, but for the spectacle. They had come to see the fallen angel. Rosalie Kane sat on a simple wooden stool at the foot of the altar, facing the congregation. She wore a dress of coarse gray wool, high-collared and long-sleeved, devoid of lace or ribbon. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, exposing the pale curve of her neck. She wore no jewelry. Her hands were folded in her lap, still and composed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. To the crowd, she looked like a penitent. She looked like a woman broken by her time in the wilderness. But they did not notice that her spine was straight, or that her eyes, though lowered, were clear. Behind the pulpit stood her father, the Reverend Elias Kane. He looked haggard, his clerical collar loose around a neck that had grown thin from worry. He gripped the edges of the lectern as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He believed he was saving his daughter. He believed that by airing her sin and demanding public repentance, he could reintegrate her into the fold, saving her from the social exile that was worse than death in the frontier. In the front row, sitting in the place of honor usually reserved for the mayor, was Jonas Pike. The railroad baron looked immaculate in a black suit, his silver hair gleaming in the shafts of light. Beside him sat Marshal Burke Caldwell, his arm in a sling, his good hand resting casually on the handle of his revolver. Caldwell had a sheaf of papers on his lap, which he tapped rhythmically against his knee. "Brothers and sisters," Elias began, his voice lacking its usual thunder, "we are gathered here today not in celebration, but in judgment and in hope. We are here to listen to the testimony of a daughter of this church who was led astray, who fell into the hands of darkness and has returned to seek the light." A murmur rippled through the room. "We must be merciful," Elias continued, glancing nervously at Pike. "But we must also be vigilant. The dangers surrounding our peaceful town are real. The savagery is real." Jonas Pike stood up slowly. He turned to the crowd, his face a mask of solemn concern. "Reverend, if I may, we are all relieved to see Miss Kane return safely. But the town is on edge. The miners are afraid to work the northern claims. We need to know exactly what happened out there. We need to know the nature of the threat." Pike turned his eyes to Rosalie. They were cold, dead eyes that promised ruin. "And we need to know if the savages are planning to attack the railroad." "Marshal Caldwell," Elias said, ceding the floor. "Please." Caldwell stood and walked to the front. He did not go to the pulpit. He paced back and forth in front of Rosalie, like a wolf circling a wounded fawn. He stopped and looked down at her. "Miss Kane," Caldwell said, his voice loud enough to reach the back pews, "you disappeared 3 nights ago? You claim you were confused, but witnesses saw you riding toward the canyon, toward the Navajo camp." Rosalie raised her head. "I went to find the truth. Marshal—" "The truth," Caldwell laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You went to the bed of a killer. You went to the man who shot me." He gestured to his sling. "Talon Nez." The name caused a fresh wave of whispering. "Did you find him, Miss Kane?" Caldwell pressed. "I did," Rosalie said softly. "And where did you stay?" Caldwell leaned in, invading her space. Did you sleep on the ground like a dog, or were you given special accommodations? Rosalie remained silent. She looked at her father. Elias looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Answer the question," Caldwell shouted, slamming his hand against the altar rail. "Did you share a tent with the savage? Did you let him touch you? Did you douse yourself in their filth?" He waved the papers in his hand. "I have reports here, affidavits from the survey team. They say the Navajo are gathering weapons. They say they are planning to burn Red Mesa to the ground. And they say you were the prize they paraded around their camp." He turned to the crowd, playing to their prejudices. "Look at her. Does she look like a victim of kidnapping? Or does she look like a woman who went willingly to satisfy her own unnatural lusts? She is a whore." A voice shouted from the back. It was one of Pike's hired guns, planted to incite the mob. "Navajo's whore," another voice cried. Elias raised his hands. "Peace, peace, I say." But his voice was drowned out. The crowd was turning ugly. The heat and the hate were boiling over. "Tell us," Caldwell demanded, looming over Rosalie. "Admit it. You gave yourself to him. You betrayed your race and your God for the touch of a savage." Rosalie opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to unleash the fury she had been holding back since the night of the fire. But suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the church groaned. They swung open with a resounding boom that silenced the room instantly. The bright white light of the noon sun flooded the nave, blinding those inside for a moment. Silhouetted in the doorway stood 4 figures. They walked in silence. Their boots made no sound on the floorboards. It was Talon Nez. Flanking him were 2 older Navajo warriors and Haitian TSO, the clan elder. They were unarmed. No rifles, no knives visible at their waists. They wore their finest buckskins, adorned with silver and turquoise that caught the light. Talon walked in the center, his head high, his long black hair flowing over his shoulders. He carried nothing but a worn leather saddlebag in his left hand. A gasp went through the congregation. Men reached for their hip holsters, but the sheer audacity of the entrance froze them. To shoot unarmed men in the house of God, even savages, was a step few were willing to take without a direct order. "Marshal," Pike shouted, his composure cracking. "Arrest them, they are trespassing." Caldwell drew his revolver, leveling it at Talon. "Take one more step, Nez, and I will paint the floor with your brains." Talon did not stop. He did not speed up. He walked with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. His eyes locked on Rosalie. The crowd parted for them, shrinking back as if they were afraid of being burned by the mere proximity of the warriors. Talon stopped 10 feet from the altar, ignoring the gun pointed at his chest. He looked at Rosalie. "I told you," he said, his voice deep and resonant in the silent church. "I would not let you stand alone." Rosalie stood up. The gray wool dress seemed to fall away in her mind, replaced by the armor of her conviction. She turned to Caldwell, who was now looking frantically between Talon and the crowd, trying to gauge if he could shoot without starting a riot he couldn't control. "You asked me a question." "Marshal?" Rosalie said. Her voice was no longer the soft tremble of the choir girl. It was clear, projected from the diaphragm, the voice of a woman who knew how to fill a hall. "You asked if I lay in his bed." She looked at her father, then at Pike, and finally directly into the eyes of the women in the front row who had shunned her. "Yes," Rosalie said. "I lay in the bed of the Navajo warrior." The shock in the room was palpable. A physical blow. Elias made a sound like a wounded animal. "But not for the reasons your dirty mind imagines," Rosalie continued, her voice rising. "I did not lie there because I was forced, and I did not lie there because I was lost." She took a step toward the congregation. "I lay there because it was the only place in this entire territory where I was treated with honor. I lay there because, for the first time in my life, my body was not a piece of property. It was not a bargaining chip for a merchant's marriage proposal. It was not an asset for my father's church. It was mine." She pointed a shaking finger at Caldwell. "You call them savages, you, who shoots children in the dark, you, who burn camps and call it justice." "Shut her up," Pike hissed at Elias. "For God's sake, shut her up." But Elias was frozen, staring at his daughter as if he had never seen her before. Talon stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately placing the leather saddlebag on the communion table, the holiest place in the church. "You speak of contracts," Talon said to Pike. "You speak of the law." He opened the bag. With hands that did not tremble, he pulled out a thick roll of parchment and a large, folded map. Pike's face was drained of blood. He recognized the leather of the bag. It was his own courier pouch, kept in the supposedly impenetrable Mosler safe in his office. "That is stolen property," Pike shrieked. "Seize it." "It is the truth," Talon said. He unfurled the map and held it up. It was a detailed surveyor's map of the territory. A thick red line cut through the town of Red Mesa and drove straight through the heart of the Chusca foothills. But it was the notes in the margins, written in Pike's own distinctive, spidery hand, that drew the eye. "Read it," Talon challenged the room. "Is there anyone here who can read the white man's writing?" An old miner, a man named Silas, heavy with coal dust and years, stood up from the third pew. He was a deacon of the church, a man respected for his honesty if not his wealth. "I can read," Silas said gruffly. He walked to the front, squinting at the map Talon held. "What does it say?" "Silas," a woman asked from the back. Silas adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the map, then at the parchment contract Talon had laid on the table. He read the text aloud, his voice gravelly. "Survey line 4. Obstruction Navajo burial grounds. Solution removal of indigenous population by any means necessary. Classification hostile insurrection to justify military clearance." Silas looked up, his eyes wide. "It says clearance. Jonas, it says you plan to wipe them out to save the cost of going around the mountain." He picked up the contract. "And this ain't a treaty. This is a deed of transfer. It says the signatory agrees to forfeit all surface and subsurface rights, including the water table." Silas turned to the crowd, waving the paper. "It ain't just the Indians. Boys, look at the coordinates, section 4, paragraph 2. This contract claims the water rights for the whole valley. If we sign this, if we let them build this line, the railroad owns the creek. They own the wells. They own the water your cattle drink." The mood in the room shifted instantly. The racial hatred that Pike had carefully cultivated was suddenly eclipsed by a much older, much deeper frontier instinct, the fear of losing water. "Is that true?" "Pike," a rancher shouted, standing up. "It is a standard clause," Pike stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Just legal boilerplate. We would never restrict the town's access." "Liar," Rosalie shouted. She stepped up beside Talon. They stood together, the white woman in gray wool and the Navajo warrior in buckskin, a united front against the powers of the room. "I was there 3 nights ago," Rosalie announced. "I saw the camp at Coyote's Tooth. Marshal Caldwell claims he was attacked. He lied?" She turned to Caldwell. "I saw you ride in with red armbands. I saw you give the order. You shot a man who had his hands in the air. His name was Bigay. He was a father. You shot him in the chest." "She is hysterical," Caldwell yelled, his gun hand wavering. "I saw you chase a 6-year-old boy," Rosalie continued, her voice relentless. "You tried to trample him, and when I ran out to save him, you pointed that gun at my head. You were going to kill me? Marshal, you were going to kill the preacher's daughter and blame it on the Navajo?" "She speaks the truth," Talon said. "I put the knife in his shoulder to stop him from pulling the trigger." The crowd turned to look at Caldwell. They saw the sling. They saw the guilt written in the sweat on his face. "He tried to kill Rosalie, Mrs. Higgins, the baker's wife," gasped. "Reverend, did you hear that?" Reverend Elias Kane stood paralyzed. His entire world was crumbling. The donor who had promised him a new roof was a thief. The lawman he had supported was a murderer. And his daughter was standing beside a heathen, shining with a righteousness he had not preached in years. He looked at the map on the altar. He looked at the charcoal smudge on the door. Elias walked slowly down the steps of the pulpit. He approached the communion table. He picked up the contract. His hands shook violently. He saw the signature at the bottom, Jonas Pike, and beside it, the witness seal of Marshal Burke Caldwell. "Reverend," Pike said, his voice low and threatening, "give me the papers. This is a misunderstanding. We can discuss the school funding. We can discuss the new bell tower." Elias looked at Pike. For the first time, he saw the man not as a benefactor, but as a serpent. "You told me it was empty land," Elias whispered. "You told me it was God's will." "It is progress," Pike snapped. "Do not be a fool. Elias, you want this town to die in the dust. You want to be a shepherd of nothing." Elias turned to Rosalie. He saw the friction burn on her neck. He saw the way Talon stood slightly in front of her, ready to take a bullet for her. "My daughter," Elias said, his voice cracking. "Is this true, all of it?" "It is true, Father," Rosalie said. "I swear it on my mother's Bible." Elias closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and when he opened them, the grayness was gone from his face. He turned to the congregation. He held the contract up high. "This is not a deed," Elias thundered, his voice returning with the force of an Old Testament prophet. "This is a death warrant. If we build this church on blood, it will crumble if we steal the water. We steal the life God gave us." He turned to Pike and Caldwell. "Get out of my house." Caldwell's face twisted into a snarl. "You old fool. You think you can stop the Union Pacific?" He raised his revolver, aiming not at Talon, but at Rosalie the witness, the leak, the source of it all. "No!" Elias screamed. But before Caldwell could squeeze the trigger, a sound erupted from the pews. It was the distinct, terrifying click of a dozen hammers being cocked. The miners, the ranchers, the men who had been ready to lynch Talon 10 minutes ago now had their Colts and Winchesters leveled at the marshal. "Drop it, Burke," Silas the miner said, pointing a heavy shotgun at the marshal's chest. "You ain't shooting a girl in church, and you sure as hell ain't stealing my water." Caldwell froze. He looked around the room. He saw a sea of barrels. The mob he had created had turned, not because they loved the Navajo, but because they hated being played for fools. Pike looked at the door, calculating his odds of escape. "The papers, Reverend," Pike said, trying one last time to salvage his empire. "They are company property." Elias Kane looked at the papers in his hand. He looked at the altar candle burning brightly beside him. With a deliberate, slow movement, Elias lowered the corner of the contract into the flame. "No!" Pike lunged forward. Talon stepped in his path, shoving the railroad baron back with a single hand to the chest. Pike stumbled and fell hard onto the floorboards. The paper caught. The dry parchment curled and blackened. Elias held it up as it burned. A torch of defiance. "Let it burn," Elias said. "Let the lies burn." He dropped the flaming pages onto the stone floor of the chancel. The map followed. The town watched in silence as the legal basis for the war turned to ash and smoke, drifting up toward the rafters where Rosalie's voice used to soar. Rosalie watched the fire. She felt Talon's hand brush against hers, a fleeting touch, hidden by the folds of her dress, but electric. She looked at her father. He was weeping silently, watching the fire. He had lost his patron. He had likely lost his standing with the territory authorities. But as he looked up and met her eyes, Rosalie saw something she hadn't seen in years. He was looking at her with pride, but the danger was not over. Caldwell had lowered his gun, but his eyes were darting around, feral and desperate. And outside, the distant sound of a bugle cut through the air. The cavalry scout patrol. They were early. "This isn't over," Caldwell hissed, backing toward the side door. "The army doesn't care about your little fire. They have their orders." Talon looked at Rosalie. "He is right. The paper is gone, but the soldiers are still coming." "Then we make them listen, too," Rosalie said, grabbing the leather bag which still contained the ledger of bribes she had found in the safe, the second part of her insurance policy. "We are not done yet." The church was filled with smoke, but for the first time, The air was clear. The line had been drawn, and Red Mesa was standing on the other side of it. The ashes of the map lay on the stone floor of the chancel, a black, curled monument to the deception that had almost swallowed Red Mesa whole. The smoke drifted up toward the rafters, stinging the eyes of the congregation, but no one moved to open a window. The tension in the room had shifted from a simmer to a rolling boil, and the lid had just been blown off. Silas, the coal-dusted deacon who had read the map, remained standing. He turned his shotgun away from the altar and leveled it solely at the front pew where Jonas Pike was scrambling to his feet, dusting ash from his expensive suit. "You were going to sell the creek," Silas rumbled, his voice shaking with the rage of a man who had scraped a living from the rock for 20 years. "You were going to dry us out to feed your boilers." "It was a draft," Pike shouted, his voice cracking. He held up his hands, palms out, a gesture of surrender that looked unnatural on a man used to holding a gavel. "A contingency plan. Nothing more. Standard corporate forecasting for extreme drought scenarios." "It was a death warrant," a rancher from the back shouted. "And you signed it? This is madness," Marshal Burke Caldwell roared. He stepped away from the wall, his hand hovering near his holster, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You are listening to a hysterical woman and a savage. Can you not see?" He pointed a trembling finger at Rosalie. "She is not herself. Look at her. She has been out there in the heat, sleeping in the dirt. They have drugged her. It is Navajo witchcraft. I tell you, they twist the mind." Rosalie stood by the altar, her hand resting on the leather bag. She did not look drugged. She looked like iron that had been tempered in a fire. "The only poison here, Marshal," Rosalie said, her voice cutting through his shouting, "is the greed you and Mr. Pike brought with you on that train." Caldwell snarled, a sound of pure animal frustration. "I am the law. I say this assembly is unlawful. I say these Indians are under arrest for treason." He drew his weapon. It was a mistake. In the old days, a week ago, the glint of Caldwell's badge and the threat of his violence would have been enough to cow the town. But the town had seen the map. They had seen the water rights clause. The fear of the law was outweighed by the fear of thirst. "Drop it! Burke!" The command came not from Talon, nor from Silas, but from the side aisle. Deputy Miller, a young man with a face full of freckles, who usually spent his days sweeping the jailhouse and looking at his boots, had drawn his revolver. His hands were shaking, but the barrel was pointed squarely at his boss. "Miller," Caldwell stared at him, stunned. "You turn on me for them." "I live on the creek too, Marshal," Miller said, his voice gaining strength. "And I ain't shooting the Reverend's daughter. Drop the gun." Caldwell hesitated. He looked at Miller, then he looked at the pews. It wasn't just Silas. 3 other miners had drawn concealed pistols. A farmer held a heavy walking stick like a club. The authority of the star on his chest evaporated, replaced by the cold arithmetic of lead. Slowly, with a sneer of contempt. Caldwell opened his hand. The heavy Colt revolver clattered to the floorboards. "You are making a mistake," Caldwell spat. "When the federal inspectors come—" "We sent for the inspectors, Mrs." Higgins shouted from the choir loft, brandishing a hymnal like a weapon. "We wired them yesterday, and we will tell them everything." Reverend Elias Kane stepped forward. He looked older than his 50 years, but he stood tall. He walked past the burning embers of the contract and stopped in front of Talon Nez and the Navajo elders. The church went silent. This was the moment that would define the soul of Red Mesa. Elias looked at Talon, the man he had preached against, the heathen he had warned his flock to fear. Then he looked at Hastian TSO, the elder whose face was etched with the history of the land Elias had tried to claim for his own god. Slowly, stiffly, Elias Kane knelt. He did not kneel in prayer. He knelt in supplication. "I have sinned," Elias said, his voice echoing in the rafters. "I have coveted my neighbor's land. I have borne false witness." He looked up at Hastian TSO. "I thought I was bringing God to the wilderness. But I see now that I was only bringing a thief in a silk suit, this church." He gestured around at the whitewashed walls. "If it is built on stolen ground, it is not a house of God. It is a house of greed. He lowered his head. Forgive me. Hasty and TSO looked down at the white holy man. The elder's face remained impassive, but his eyes softened around the edges. He reached out a weathered hand and touched Elias's shoulder, a bridge across a chasm of blood and misunderstanding. The land forgives the rain for the flood, the elder said in English. But the flood must recede. It will, Rosalie said. She stepped down to her father's side, placing a hand on his back. It will, while the town watched the reconciliation. Jonas Pike saw his opening. He edged toward the side exit, moving with the stealth of a rat in a grain bin. He pushed the door open, slipping out into the blinding sunlight of the alley. He made it 3 steps before he ran into a wall of denim and flannel. 4 farmers stood there, arms crossed. They were big men who wrestled plows through hard earth. Going somewhere, Mr. Pike, one of them asked pleasantly. I must send a telegram, Pike stammered, clutching his lapels. To stop the army. Yes, to stop the misunderstanding. We think you have sent enough telegrams, the farmer said. He reached out and grabbed Pike's arm. Empty your pockets. You have no right, Pike squealed. I am a citizen of stature. The farmer ignored him. Reaching into Pike's interior coat pocket, he pulled out a leather wallet and a folded sheaf of letters. He opened one, scanning it. Well now, the farmer read aloud. To Captain Harris, ensure the removal is permanent. No witnesses to the prior habitation of the ridge. Bonus upon completion. The farmer looked at Pike with disgust. Sounds like murder for hire to me. They marched Pike back into the church, throwing him down next to the disarmed marshal. Lock them up, Silas ordered. Put them in the back cell. And Miller, you keep the key. If Caldwell tries to talk his way out, you gag him. The procession that led the 2 men to the jailhouse was solemn. There was no cheering. This was not a festival. It was a reckoning. The town of Red Mesa watched as the symbols of their progress, the law and the money, were marched down the dusty street and shoved behind the iron bars they had purchased. But as the heavy door of the jail clanged shut, the euphoria of the moment began to fade, replaced by the grim reality of the frontier. The crowd dispersed slowly. People stood in small knots on the boardwalks, whispering. What happens now? A woman asked, clutching her shawl. Pike owns the mine. He owns the general store note. If he goes to prison, we starve, a miner finished for her, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Railroad pulls out. Town dies. We're standing in a ghost town. Boys. Rosalie stood on the church steps, watching them. She heard the whispers. She saw the looks. They were not all looks of gratitude. Some were looks of resentment. She had saved their water. Yes, but she had shattered their illusion of security. She had bitten the hand that fed them, even if that hand was diseased. They will hate you for this later, Talon said quietly. He was standing in the shadow of the doorframe, watching the street with a scout's wariness. I know, Rosalie replied. Truth is expensive. Talon, today they paid the price. Tomorrow they will count the cost. The soldiers are still coming, Talon reminded her. The telegraph Miller sent to the federal inspectors might stop a massacre, but it will not stop the cavalry from setting up a perimeter. They will want to investigate. They will poke at the land until it bleeds. What will you do? She asked, turning to face him. We go deep, Talon said. He looked toward the violet peaks of the Chuscas. We move the camp into the Spider Rock Canyon. It is narrow, defensible, and hard for wagons. You are leaving, Rosalie said. It was not a question. We must, Talon said. Pike is gone, but there are other pikes. The railroad is a snake. You cut off the head. Another grows. We need to be where the snake cannot slither. He looked at her then, and for a moment, the warrior's mask slipped. He looked just like a man who was leaving his heart behind. Come with us, he said. The words hung in the hot afternoon air. To live in the canyon? Rosalie asked. To live free, Talon said. No hymnals, no stairs, no whispers about the Navajo's whore. You speak the language of the wind now. Rosalie, you belong where the wind blows. Rosalie looked at the dusty street of Red Mesa. She saw her father sitting on the church steps, his head in his hands, a man broken but finally clean. She saw Mrs. Higgins sweeping the boardwalk, looking at her with a mixture of fear and awe. She saw the jailhouse where the monsters were caged. "If I go," Rosalie said softly, "who will make sure the story stays true?" Talon tilted his head. "The federal inspectors." Rosalie said, "They will be white men from Washington. They will look at the jail, and they will look at the Indians hiding in the canyon. If I am not here, if I am not standing right here in this church, they will twist it back. Pike has lawyers. Lawyers can undo locks." She stepped closer to him. "I have to stay. Talon, I have to testify. I have to be the nail that keeps the coffin lid shut on Jonas Pike." Talon looked at her for a long time. He raised a hand and touched the scar on her neck, the scar he had kissed. "You are choosing the harder path," he said, "to live among those who resent you." "I'm not choosing it for them," Rosalie said. "I'm choosing it for us. Someone has to guard the gate." "Then guard it well," Talon said. His voice was rough. "But know this, my fire is always lit for you. If the walls close in, follow the smoke." He did not kiss her. Not here, in the open, where it would be cheapened by the eyes of the town. He simply nodded a sharp, singular motion of respect and turned. He mounted his horse, signaled to the elders, and they rode out. They did not look back. They vanished into the heat haze of the desert as if they had been a mirage, leaving only the hoof prints in the dust to prove they had ever been there. That night, Red Mesa was quieter than it had ever been. The saloon was closed. The piano was silent. The train sat idle on the tracks, a beast asleep. Rosalie sat in the front pew of the dark church. The smell of burnt paper still lingered, acrid and sharp. Her father had gone to the parsonage to pray, leaving her alone with the silence. She felt a profound, aching loneliness. The adrenaline of the confrontation had drained away, leaving her hollow. She thought of the hogan on the ridge. She thought of the rough wool blanket and the smell of sagebrush and man. She thought of the freedom she had tasted for 3 short days. She had chosen duty over desire. It was the right choice, she told herself, but it tasted like ash. She opened the leather-bound notebook she still carried in her pocket, the Book of Melodies. She turned to a blank page. In the darkness, she began to hum. It started as the melody of Amazing Grace, the reliable 4/4 time signature of her childhood. But as she hummed, the rhythm shifted, it bent, it slowed down, picking up the heartbeat of the drum she had heard in the canyon. She opened her mouth and sang, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." But then she switched, her voice sliding effortlessly into the Navajo phonetics Talon had taught her, the words for earth and sky and endurance. "Nijonigo, nihi, kad." The song bounced off the wooden walls. It was a strange hybrid, a musical child of 2 warring parents. It was mournful, yet defiant. It was the sound of the West as it truly was not a victory of one over the other, but a painful, bloody, beautiful collision. Rosalie sang until her throat ached. She sang for the boy she had saved. She sang for the man she had loved and let go. She sang for her father's lost pride and for the miner's uncertain future. And as the last note faded into the silence, Rosalie Kane realized something. She was not trapped in Red Mesa. She was not a prisoner of the town's judgment. She was its conscience. She stood up, smoothing the skirts of her gray dress. She walked to the door, opened it, and looked out at the stars, the same stars that looked down on Talon in his canyon. "I am here," she whispered to the night wind, "and I am not going anywhere." She closed the door, not with a slam, but with a firm, decisive click. The lock engaged. The church was safe, and tomorrow, the work of rebuilding would begin. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the church passed not with the roar of a storm, but with the slow, grinding turn of a season. The heat of the Arizona summer began to break, surrendering to the crisp, golden light of early autumn. And with the change in the wind came news from the East News that traveled down the telegraph wires that had once promised only conquest. The federal inspectors had arrived. Men in dusty suits with stern faces and leather satchels filled with subpoenas. They did not stay in the hotel owned by the railroad. They set up camp near the creek, signaling their independence. The investigation was thorough. The charred remains of the map in the church were gone. But the ledger Rosalie had retrieved the book of bribes, and blood money spoke louder than ash. Jonas Pike was indicted on 12 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and the attempted misappropriation of federal lands. He was escorted to the train station in handcuffs, his silk suit rumpled, his eyes fixed on the ground to avoid the stares of the miners he had tried to swindle. Marshal Burke Caldwell fared no better. Stripped of his badge and his gun, he was held in the territorial prison in Yuma, awaiting trial for the murder of the Navajo man, Bigay. The town of Red Mesa, once terrified of his shadow, now spoke his name only as a cautionary tale to frightened children. But the greatest victory was the one that could not be put in handcuffs. The Union Pacific, desperate to distance itself from the scandal of the Red Mesa massacre that never happened, announced a route change. The iron rails would curve south, bypassing the Chuska foothills entirely. The northern ridge, with its ancient bones and silent spirits, would remain undisturbed. It was not perfect justice. The dead could not be brought back. The scars on the land and the people remained. But for the first time in the history of the territory, the machine had blinked. For Rosalie Kane, the victory brought a strange quietness. The town of Red Mesa returned to its rhythm. The miners went back to the earth. The merchants opened their shutters, and the church bell rang on Sundays. But the music had changed for her. She sat in the parsonage, mending a shirt for her father. The house was clean, the silence companionable. Yet she felt like a stranger in her own skin. She looked at the whitewashed walls and saw only confinement. She looked at the hymnal and heard only the echo of a song that was too small for her voice. One Tuesday morning, she came downstairs wearing a sturdy riding skirt of brown denim and a flannel shirt. She carried a single saddlebag. Martha Kane was in the kitchen, shelling peas. She stopped, her hands hovering over the metal bowl. She looked at Rosalie's attire, then at the bag. "You are going," Martha said. It was not a question. "I am," Rosalie replied. Martha looked down at the peas. For years, she had tried to mold Rosalie into a shape that would fit the frontier's rigid expectations. She had failed. But in that failure, she had seen something she secretly envied. "You will need a warm coat," Martha said gruffly. "The winters in the canyon are hard. Take the wool one from the cedar chest." Reverend Elias Kane stood in the doorway of his study. He held a Bible in his hands, not the grand pulpit Bible, but a smaller, personal one with a worn leather cover. He walked over to his daughter. He looked at her face, no longer seeing the child he had tried to protect, but the woman who had saved his soul from corruption. "I cannot bless this path," Elias said softly. "It goes against everything I was taught, but I cannot condemn it either, for I have seen where my path led." He pressed the Bible into her hands. "Read it, Rosalie, or do not, but keep it. It belonged to your mother. She always loved the wild places more than the pews." Rosalie took the book. She kissed her father on the cheek, tasting the salt of a tear he refused to shed. "Goodbye, Father," she whispered. "Preach the truth." "I will try," Elias said. "Go with God, my daughter, even if he speaks a different language where you are going." She saddled Bess for the last time in the church stable. She rode out of Red Mesa at noon, under the bright, unforgiving sun. She did not look back at the town, nor at the railroad tracks. She kept her eyes fixed on the violet peaks in the distance, where the shadows were deep and the silence was waiting. The journey to the new camp in Spider Rock Canyon took 2 days. The terrain was rugged, a labyrinth of red sandstone spires that rose like the fingers of the earth reaching for the sky. When she finally crested the last ridge, the valley opened up before her. It was a bowl of green and gold, sheltered by towering cliffs. Smoke curled from a dozen hogans. Sheep grazed near a winding stream. It was a place that felt hidden, a secret pocket of the world that time had forgotten. Talon Nez was waiting for her. He stood at the edge of the tree line, leaning against the trunk of a twisted juniper. He did not wave. He did not run to her. He simply watched her ride down the slope, his stillness a force of gravity that pulled her in. Rosalie pulled Bess to a halt a few yards away. She slid from the saddle, her boots hitting the soft earth with a thud. She was covered in dust, her hair escaping her braid, her face flushed with the sun. Talon looked at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but his chest rose and fell with a breath he had been holding for weeks. "You came back," he said. "I did," Rosalie replied. Talon stepped away from the tree. He did not bridge the distance between them yet. He needed to know the nature of her arrival. "Why?" he asked. "Did you come because you felt guilty?" "Rosalie, did you come because you missed the thrill, or did you come because you have nowhere else to go?" Rosalie dropped the reins. She walked toward him, stopping only when she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. "I did not come for guilt," she said, "and I did not come because I was lost." She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, warm, and real. "I came," she said, a smile breaking across her face like dawn, "because I want to sing every single day without asking permission from anyone, and I want to sing with you." Talon let out a low laugh, a sound of pure, unburdened relief. He pulled her to him, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground. "Then you will sing," he promised, burying his face in the crook of her neck, right over the scar, until the mountains crack. They did not move into his old hogan. That place belonged to the scout, the solitary warrior. Instead, they built a new one. They chose a spot high on the southern slope, where the earth was firm and the view stretched all the way to the Sleeping Lady Formation on the horizon. They built it together. Rosalie learned to mix the adobe mud, smoothing it over the log frame until her hands were stained red with the earth. Talon felled the pine trees, stripping the bark with the long, rhythmic strokes of his knife. They built the door facing east, to greet the morning sun, as was the custom. It was a way of saying that every day was a new beginning, a renewal of the blessing of life. When the structure was finished, smells of fresh pine and drying earth filling the air. They brought in the furniture. There was not much: a table, 2 chairs, and the bed. It was the same narrow, sturdy wooden frame from the old hogan, the bed that had known his nightmares, the bed where they had laid together in chaste, burning agony before the trial. They placed it against the far wall, covering it with fresh sheepskins and a quilt Rosalie had brought in her saddlebag. Rosalie placed her hand on the rough wood of the headboard. "It looks different here," she said. "It is not a warrior's bed anymore," Talon said, standing behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "It is a bed for 2 people who are tired of fighting." Life in the canyon was not the romantic idyll of poets. It was hard work. It was hauling water from the creek, grinding corn until her shoulders ached, and learning to read the weather in the flight of hawks. But it was a life of profound substance. Rosalie found her place not just as Talon's partner, but as a member of the tribe. She began to teach. It started with one curious child, a boy named Ashki, who wanted to know what the letters on a discarded coffee tin meant. They sat under the sprawling branches of an ancient cypress tree near the creek. Rosalie said, drawing the letter in the sand. "A is for apple." "A is for ataid," Ashki corrected her, using the Navajo word for girl. Rosalie laughed. "Yes, A is for at-eid." Soon, the class grew. 10 children, then 20. They sat in a semicircle, their dark eyes wide with intelligence. Rosalie taught them English, not the English of the treaties that stole their land, but the English of poetry, of songs, of negotiation. She taught them to read so that one day no man like Pike could trick them again. In return, they taught her. They taught her the songs of the harvest, the songs of the weaving, the songs of the stars. They corrected her pronunciation with ruthless, giggling honesty until her throat learned to shape the sounds of the high desert. As winter turned to spring, The canyon began to change. Word had spread of the sanctuary in Spider Rock. It was not just Navajo who came. First came a miner named O'Malley, a man with lungs blackened by coal dust who could no longer work the deep veins. He asked only for a place to breathe clean air. Talon let him stay. O'Malley built a small shack and tended a vegetable garden, sharing his harvest with the tribe. Then came a woman named Sarah, a white widow from Santa Fe who had been cast out by her family for loving an Apache tracker who had since died. She brought with her a knowledge of herbal medicine and a heart full of unspent love. Slowly, organically, a community formed. It was a ragtag collection of the unwanted, the displaced, and the dreamers. There were no written laws in the valley. There was no sheriff. There was only one unspoken rule. Enforced by the shared reality of survival, no one belongs to anyone else. We belong to each other. One evening, deep in the heart of winter, the wind howled outside the hogan, banking snow against the log walls. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a warm, ruddy glow over the room. Rosalie and Talon lay on the wooden bed. The air was thick with the scent of pinon smoke and intimacy. There were no more barriers between them. The hesitation of the past, the fear of judgment, the weight of the church, it was all gone, stripped away like layers of old paint to reveal the grain of the wood beneath. Talon traced the line of Rosalie's jaw with his fingertips. "You are quiet tonight," he murmured. "I was thinking," Rosalie whispered, shifting closer to him, her skin warm against his, "about the first time I saw you. In the church, you looked so angry." "I was angry," Talon admitted. "I looked at you and I saw everything I hated, the softness, the blindness." "And now?" Rosalie asked, looking up at him. Talon smiled, a slow expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Now, I look at you and I see the iron. I see the woman who walked into fire for a child she did not know." He kissed her then, a kiss that was deep and unhurried. It was a conversation without words, a language of breath and touch. They moved together with a familiarity that felt ancient. There was no desperate scrambling, no frantic need to prove anything. There was only the slow, rhythmic affirmation of their presence. Rosalie laughed softly, a sound that bubbled up from her chest as Talon pulled the quilt over their heads, creating a private world within a world. The sturdy wooden bed frame creaked in protest, a rhythmic sound that joined the popping of the fire. "Talon," she breathed, her voice catching. "I am here," he answered. "I am nowhere else." The firelight danced on the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of a love that had fought the world to exist the deep, shuddering breaths of a warrior laying down his burden, and the joyous, uninhibited laughter of a woman who had finally found her song. The next morning, while Talon was tending to the horses, Rosalie sat at the small table. She opened the Bible her father had given her. She took a piece of parchment and a quill. She wrote for a long time, her hand steady. "Dearest Father, I send this to you by the hand of O'Malley, who travels to town for supplies. Do not worry for me. The canyon is cold, but my fire is warm. You once told me that a woman's virtue is her only treasure. You were wrong. My treasure is my voice. My treasure is my choice. I want you to know that I am safe, and more than safe. I am whole. I have been loved. Father, not as an angel to be worshipped on a pedestal, nor as a child to be scolded. I have been loved as a woman to be trusted. I have found a man who does not want to own me, but to walk beside me. Do not pray for my salvation. Pray for my song. For it is loud, and it is free. Your daughter, Rosalie." She folded the letter and tucked it inside the Bible, marking the page of the Song of Solomon. She handed the book to O'Malley, knowing it would find its way back to the parsonage. A final closing of the circle. Years passed. The story of the valley began to drift out into the territory, carried by the wind and the whispers of travelers. They spoke of a place in the shadow of the Chuscas where the world was different. They told of children with eyes of every color: Navajo brown, Irish green, Mexican black, playing together in the creek, speaking a pidgin language that was half English, half Dine. They told of a school under a cypress tree where a woman with hair like spun silver taught reading from a book of laws and a book of songs. And they told of the music. Travelers passing on the distant wagon road would stop their horses at dawn, straining to hear it. It was a melody that drifted down from the canyon, a dual harmony of a baritone and a soprano. It was a song that sounded like the earth singing to the sky. The railroad did come to the territory, but it ran 30 miles to the south. The smoke of the locomotives was just a faint smudge on the horizon, a reminder of the beast that passed them by. On a late afternoon, 10 years after the trial, Rosalie stood in the doorway of the hogan. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in brilliant stripes of vermilion and violet. She was older now. The sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, and her hands were rough from work. But she was beautiful in a way the girl in the gray dress had never been. She was vibrant. Talon came up the path from the corral. He walked with a slight limp, the legacy of an old horse break, but his shoulders were as broad as ever. He stopped beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. His hand rested comfortably on her hip, a gesture of easy possession that went both ways. They looked out at the horizon, far away. Miles across the desert floor, they could see the tiny black snake of a train crawling across the landscape. It looked insignificant against the vastness of the land. "It is running late," Talon noted, judging the light. "Let it be late," Rosalie said. "We have nowhere to go." She leaned her head against his shoulder. She thought of the church door with the charcoal words. She thought of the fear that used to choke her. It all seemed like a story from another lifetime. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "When I asked you to kiss me to hide the scar?" Talon looked down at her. He touched the faint white line on her neck, now barely visible. "I remember," he said. "I remember the taste of your fear." Rosalie turned in his arms, facing him. She took his hand and pressed it against her heart. "I am not afraid anymore." "Talon," she said. Her voice was steady, resonant, the voice of the valley itself. "In this place," she whispered. "I don't need anyone to kiss me to say I'm clean. I don't need anyone to tell me I'm worthy. I am mine. I belong to this dust, and this wind, and this beat in my chest." She smiled, and her eyes reflected the last golden light of the sun. "And because I am finally, truly mine," she said, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of sage and eternity. "That is the only reason I can truly be yours." The sun slipped below the horizon, and the stars began to wake up over the canyon, the first slender one, the rabbit tracks, and the lamps of God shining down on the home of the free. Thank you, dear reader, for riding this long trail with me. We have journeyed through the dust of Red Mesa, faced the fire of prejudice, and found a sanctuary in the canyon. It has been an honor to tell the story of Rosalie and Talon. I would love to hear your voice around the campfire. Please leave a comment below and tell me where in the world are you listening to this story from. What did you think of Rosalie's choice? If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like if it touched your heart, and hit that hype button so we can share this story with more travelers on the digital frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.